The storm had not yet broken outside, but inside the cattle baron's lodge, thunder was already loose. The parlor smelled of leather, pipe smoke, and old wood polished by generations of power. A fire hissed low in the hearth. An untouched whiskey sat trembling in a crystal decanter. Above the mantel hung a portrait of the man who built this empire, the same man now pacing its floor in a quiet rage. Calvin Briggs, ruler of 3 counties worth of cattle land, stood by the window watching dusk settle over fenced acres that bore his name. His shoulders were broad from years of work, but his heart had long turned to iron. Behind him stood his son, hat in hand, boots muddy, jaw tight, lingering like an unwanted shadow. "You think this is about love?" Calvin said without turning. His voice was flat and cold. He struck a match, lit his cigar, and drew slow. "You'll marry her, ugly or not, and that's final." The son blinked. He had not asked about her looks. He had not even admitted to meeting her. Still, his father knew his vanity, his pride, his foolish hope that marriage might mean something more than land and contracts. He said nothing. Calvin turned, eyes sharp. "Well, you got something to say, or are you waiting for a prettier reason?" The son spoke quietly, not in defiance but curiosity. "Is she ugly?" Silence fell. Even the fire seemed to wait. Calvin's mouth curled. "Your eyes don't need to eat. Your legacy does." He poured a drink and left the glass untouched. "Marry her. Give the child your name. Take her land with it, or walk out that door and forget you ever came from me." No names were spoken, but the threat was clear. Thomas Briggs had swallowed his father's orders for 26 years like bitter medicine, but this one stuck. The Hartwell land stretched 200 acres along their northern border, land Calvin had wanted for decades. The daughter, Elelanina Hartwell, was the last of her line after sickness took her parents the winter before. "She's got the deed," Calvin said, settling into his chair. "No brothers. You marry her, and the Hartwell name dies. Our cattle graze where her people bled. And if I refuse? Then you ride tonight and don't come back." Thomas nodded. He knew his father meant it. "When's the ceremony?" "Saturday. 2 days. Quick and legal." Rain began tapping the windows as destiny rolled forward. The Hartwell homestead sat against the hillside like a mourner dressed in black. Paint peeled from the shutters, but the bones of the house were strong. Thomas rode up with his stomach clenched tight. 2 sleepless nights had worn him raw. The door opened before he knocked. She stood there in a dark dress, hair pulled back, severe and practical. Not ugly, not beautiful either, but her eyes were clear and steady, seeing straight through him. "You must be Thomas Briggs," she said. "Miss Hartwell." "It's Elelanina," she replied, stepping aside. "And you can stop pretending. We both know why you're here." Inside, the house was clean, but hollow. Furniture covered in white sheets like ghosts. Lavender soap mixed with loneliness soaked into the walls. "Reverend Patterson will be here at 2, she said. "Coffee or whiskey?" "Coffee." She poured with practiced hands. "You could have refused," she said at last. "So could you." "I couldn't," she said softly. "A woman alone doesn't keep land long, not with men like your father." "I'm not him." "Maybe not, but you're here." The truth stung. At exactly 2, the Reverend arrived. The ceremony lasted 7 minutes. They spoke vows without looking at each other, signed papers with steady hands, and became husband and wife without warmth or celebration. Afterward, silence filled the house again. "I'll take the spare room," Thomas said. "Good," Elelanina replied. "Supper's at 6. That night, 2 strangers slept under the same roof, bound by law, land, and a future neither had chosen, both wondering what price would be paid for obedience. 3 weeks into the marriage, the Hartwell house settled into a rhythm that felt more like survival than living. Elelanina rose before dawn to tend the chickens and milk the cow. Thomas took the heavier work, fixing fences, checking the small herd, repairing whatever the wind broke in the night. They ate breakfast in silence, worked apart through the day, and shared supper with talk limited to weather and chores. It was lonely, but it held together. Then the sky turned orange. Thomas woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of horses screaming. He was on his feet before fear could catch him. pulling on boots and running to the window that faced the pasture. Fire rolled across the dry grass like a living thing, driven by wind that had not rested in months. The blaze raced toward the barn, where winter hay was stacked high. "Elelynina!" he shouted, pounding on her door. She appeared, already alert, pulling on clothes with quick hands. One look at his face told her everything. How bad? Quote, "Bad and getting worse." They moved without debate. Thomas cut fence wire and drove cattle toward the creek where the ground stayed wet. Elelynina dug trenches around the barn, shoulders burning, hands steady. The fire crested the hill as they released the horses. Heat struck like a wall, turning night into a bright, terrible day. "The house!" Thomas shouted. They dragged the hose, worked the pump until water came in weak bursts, soaked the roof and walls. Smoke filled their lungs. Ash fell like snow. When the fire finally passed, the barn lay in blackened ruin, fences gone, but the house still stood. They sat on the steps at dawn, sharing well water and staring at the scorched land. "Thank you," Elelynina said. "For staying," Thomas answered. "This is my home now, too." She did not move away when his shoulder brushed hers. When she stood to make coffee, she squeezed his hand once, brief, enough. The days after the fire drew them closer without words. Meals lasted longer. Work overlapped. Silence became easier. When the harvest festival came to Millbrook, Elelynina planned to stay home, but Thomas asked her to come. Not ordered, asked. "People will stare," she said. "Let them," he replied. "You're my wife." She wore her mother's blue dress. He bought her a ribbon and tied it around her wrist himself. At the cider booth, whispers followed them. Mrs. Henderson smiled sharp and sweet, hinting that Calvin Briggs would surely help rebuild. Thomas stepped closer to Elelynina and spoke of insurance money, of her books, of their plans. Pride sat in his voice. Mrs. Henderson's smile faltered. On the ride home, the silence felt warm. 3 days later, Thomas rode to his father's ranch alone. Calvin sat in the same chair, the same decanter nearby. "We're not selling the Hartwell land," Thomas said. Calvin rose, anger flashing. "That wasn't the deal." "Your deal," Thomas replied. "Not mine." "I built a legacy," Calvin growled. "I found a wife worth fighting for." The words surprised them both. Thomas left without looking back, lighter than he had ever felt. Winter came early. By December, the rebuilt barn held hay. Fences stood straight. One night a knock came hard at the door. Calvin stood on the porch, snow on his coat, breath white. He offered money. A railroad wanted land. Enough to start fresh, somewhere warm. California. Thomas and Elelynina sat long after he left, the contract between them. "This land is my family," Elelynina said. "If I sell, I carry their ghosts forever." "Then we fight," Thomas said. They rode together to meet the survey crew and refused the offer, calm, final. The men packed up and left. On the ride home, Elelynina spoke softly. "When this is done, would you want to be married for real?" Thomas stopped his horse and looked at her. "I thought we already were." She smiled like sunrise. But the fight was not finished yet. The railroad had power, and Calvin Briggs did not forgive easily. Snow fell thick across the valley as danger gathered quiet and patient, waiting for the next move. The railroad did not answer right away, and that silence was worse than threats. Winter deepened across Colorado, laying snow thick over burned pasture and fresh fence lines. Each morning, Thomas rose before light, breaking ice at the troughs, checking the herd, watching the horizon for riders who did not belong. Elelynina kept the books, stretched supplies, and planned for spring with quiet determination. They did not speak of fear, but it lived with them, sleeping in corners and listening at doors. In January, the letter came. Official paper, heavy seal, notice of intent to pursue eminent domain if negotiations failed. Thomas read it twice, then handed it to Elelynina. She read it once and folded it carefully, as if calm could be pressed into the paper. "We expected this," she said. "We'll answer." They hired a lawyer from Denver, a careful man with tired eyes, who warned them the fight would not be quick. Court dates were set, depositions taken. The railroad men came again, measuring and marking, always polite, always certain progress would win. Thomas watched them from the ridge, jaw tight, hand resting on his rifle, knowing violence would only prove their point. Calvin Briggs did not come, but his shadow did. Men whispered that he was backing the railroad, that he stood to gain if the route cut close enough to absorb what remained. Whether true or not, the rumor settled like frost. Elelonena heard it in town and came home silent, hands shaking only once before steadying. They worked harder. They saved every dollar. They learned each other's tempers and strengths. Thomas learned that Elelonena never quit a task once started. Elelonena learned that Thomas carried guilt like a second skin and needed quiet to shed it. At night, they sat by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes not, the space between them no longer guarded. In February, the first hearing came. The courthouse was crowded with suits and maps, and men who spoke of public good as if it were a simple thing. Elelonena testified about the land, about water rights and grazing patterns, about how the route would poison the creek. Thomas spoke of rebuilding after the fire, of insurance paid and fences raised, of a home worth protecting. The judge listened, face unreadable. Weeks passed. Snow melted and froze again. Then, the decision arrived. The railroad was denied the route through their property. Alternative paths existed. The cost of forcing the issue outweighed the benefit. They read the ruling at the kitchen table. Elelonena closed her eyes and breathed. Thomas laughed once, short and disbelieving, then pulled her into an embrace that surprised them both. It was not rushed. It was not uncertain. It felt earned. Spring followed. Grass pushed through blackened earth. Calves were born. The apple tree by the kitchen window bloomed stubborn and white. Elelonena baked pies and shared them with neighbors who now smiled without sharp edges. Thomas repaired the last fence and stood back to admire the line, straight and strong. Calvin Briggs arrived on a clear morning, riding alone. He dismounted slowly, age showing at last in the careful way he moved. Elelonena stood in the doorway. Thomas met his father halfway. "I heard," Calvin said. "You won." "We kept what was ours," Thomas replied. Calvin looked past him to the house, to the curtains, the garden starting up. "You chose hard ground." Thomas nodded. "So did you, once." Silence stretched. Calvin's eyes softened, only a little. "I won't pretend I was right," he said, "but I won't say I was wrong either. A man does what he knows." "And learns," Thomas said. Calvin met Elelonena's gaze. "You have grit," he said. "This land suits you." She inclined her head. It always did. He left without shaking hands, but without threats. It was enough. That summer, Thomas and Elelonena stood in the field at dusk, watching cattle settle. The wind moved the grass like water. Thomas took her hand, no hesitation now. "Would you marry me again?" he asked, this time by choice. She smiled, steady and warm. "Yes." They held a small ceremony under the apple tree. Neighbors came. The Reverend smiled without worry. Vows were spoken with eyes meeting and voices sure. When they kissed, it was quiet and real, like everything else they had built. Years passed. The ranch grew. Children came, taught to work and to stay. The railroad tracks ran elsewhere. Calvin Briggs visited sometimes, stiff and proud, softer with the grandchildren. Elelonena's pies fed many winters. Thomas learned to laugh easily. It was not a love born of songs. It was built in fire and silence, in choice and stubborn hope. It stayed when it mattered,